And then I also like doing these because A, we get some information, and then B, we get to hear from somebody in real life, which I'll be introducing her in just a moment, to learn more about the fives in our life. So we may not resonate with this, but there's probably a person or two on our teams and our lives somewhere that do. So this will give some additional insight and information about better communicating, collaborating, just being in a relationship with that type 5 energy. So those of you who may or may not be as familiar with the type 5, they are sometimes known as the observer or the innovator, the expert, the thought leader sometimes. And we'll get into why some of those nicknames have surfaced. The core driver here for our type 5s is one that I've kind of been talking more about, and I can't wait to hear from our informant how this resonates. But I got this core driver from Mario Sikora, who does a lot of corporate trainings. A lot of times when you hear about the 5, you'll hear that they're striving to be capable and competent, and I think that is accurate. I think even more accurate and clarifying is this feeling of wanting to be detached from heavy emotions, from other people's drain on their time. So we'll talk more a little bit about what that means. Initially, it might sound negative, but it's really a way so that they can focus on the knowledge, the data, the research that is so important for them to understand. So when they walk into a room or when they are, approaching a project, they're focusing on the data, the information, the knowledge. Honestly, like at the end of the day, it's how can I read more, listen more, hear more, dive in more, and get that knowledge. They will have a tendency, this isn't 100% true for 100% of the 5s, but they have a tendency to observe from afar and take time to process. So they may be somebody who is sitting quietly in a meeting, and from the outside you may think, "Oh my gosh, they're not engaged or they're bored or whatever." And really, they're absolutely taking in the information. They're just kind of processing it from afar. They may not have an initial idea or a thought. Marissa is on joining us live, and she said that she asked, are 5s visionaries? And yes, they're very innovative. They're very visionary. Sometimes 7s get that reputation, but 5s very much have that superpower as well. And then the other thing to know about our 5s is their ability to manage their time and their resources. So protecting their time, protecting their resources is a priority for our 5s. We talked about superpowers. One of them is this ability to glean really key, important, useful insight from a lot of data and a lot of information. They're able to quickly kind of see the patterns, the connections, and combine it to share some really helpful data research with whoever it is or whatever project is needed. They're able to kind of see what others are not. Sometimes they have a tendency to overthink a little bit and kind of get in their head about needing more information before taking action. So for the 5 growth, it's going to be kind of balancing that. They can isolate sometimes, just wanting to be with their, alone with their knowledge and their resources, and just they don't need people. They just need their books. And then they have, sometimes this can actually be an asset, and then other times it could be something to maybe look at, this ability to compartmentalize. And so 5s, again, going back to that priority of wanting to protect their time and resource, if something bad is happening or they're experiencing a negative feeling or somebody's bringing something negative to them, it's okay, well, that's happening in my personal life, but at work, we don't need to talk about that. I don't need to share about that. I honestly don't need to hear about that from you. So they kind of have an expectation that other people will also kind of compartmentalize in certain situations too. They are in the head or the thinking center, which explains some of the overanalyzing, overthinking at times. And our fives are in this area too. This is important to know for those of us who are not in this category, that when we experience a problem, some people want to be heard. They want to say, I'm really sad or I'm really mad. And a five tends to jump in and go into problem solving mode immediately. What needs to be done? There's a rational solution. Let's investigate it. Let's figure out what needs to be done, which again is a great in certain situations. And others, it can make that other person feel incredibly unseen, unheard. That's like, wait a minute. I didn't really want a problem solution here. I just wanted to vent. And then when they get things done, I mentioned if you're leading a type five, if you are working side by side with a five, to give them time and space to kind of investigate, look at all the information, look at all the data, give them time to think about the solution or what the next step should be, and then process that. The kind of just do it, just jump in, just wing it, isn't always helpful for our type fives. So that's kind of the textbook description of our type fives. I want to bring in our type five informant now, Kathy, who is going to be talking to us here. I'm just going to remove this for a second. Kathy, welcome to our case file review today.
Sarah, I am really excited about being here. And the whole time I was backstage, I was going, yes, that's right. That sounds just like me. Yes.
Well, before we dive in, would you share a little bit more about what you do and then how you knew that the type five was your dominant Enneagram type?
So again, my name is Kathy Farah. So I am a online business manager. And basically, I help business owners kind of take the critical task off their plate so that they can focus on what they do best. They're growing their business and helping clients. And I can kind of help people look at their backend systems and make things, a little more profitable and efficient for them behind the scenes, where they can kind of focus with what they want to do.
I always think like taps in so well to that ability to provide insight and like
Yeah.
kind of get into the weeds and then like make it meaningful, make those numbers, those processes actually be useful and meaningful.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm able to really listen to problems that are going on in somebody's business, and then I can think about solutions pretty quickly. Like, oh, I've got some ideas. I can almost be a little overwhelming because I have several things in my mind, so I have to remember that I have to present that in a little easier to understand way. And so we can kind of work on those things. So yeah, that's definitely the five, all the data that's in my head.
Yes. So what was it like for your typing experience? Was it the process where it's like, oh, this is me, can't be any other type? Were you teetering between a couple, or what helped you land on the type five?
Truly, when I read the type five, it immediately resonated with me that that's me, because I do have a tendency to be in my head. I could listen to, like, if I'm trying to learn stuff, I have podcasts in my, that I'm listening to. Like, I'll start getting into a series where I'm listening to audiobooks and podcasts, and like, I just absorb. So I want to absorb a lot of information. So I'm usually reading a number of things, and I can literally realize I haven't seen anyone in days, because I am so in my head with different ideas, and wanting to learn new things. So that for me, five almost immediately hit me when we were looking at the types, because I do, I can overanalyze. I could, so I could see all those things, the positives and the negatives right away, just spoke to me.
Yeah. And I hear that from other fives that when you identify with that, a lot of times it is like Yeah, probably couldn't be anything else. Sometimes there's some confusion between 3 and 5s, sometimes 1 and 5s. And we'll get to some resources at the end if you are kind of stuck in between a few. The other thing I would love to hear about, Kathy, I'm going to share my screen again, is so our type 5s, we talk about arrows a lot of times. As being one of my favorite things about the Enneagram is the how fluid it is. And so it's not just, the snapshot of type 5, but it's in growth. We have our wings, we have our stress. And what I have heard from others is in the identification process and then like gaining some insight, sometimes those arrows can be one of the most eye-opening pieces of their Enneagram learning experience. And for our type 5s, they have a stress arrow or sometimes a supporting strategy of the type 7, which are striving to feel excited. And so our 5s will kind of use that striving to feel excited to support all the knowledge and all the ideas and all the thinking that they're doing. Sometimes though, when in stress or maybe not being as intentional, 7s can also become very scattered, very all over the place, have a very hard time focusing, which is another superpower of a 5, but in times of stress kind of fall into some of those qualities of a 7. Whereas on the other side of that, our type 8 is known as the growth arrow or the neglected strategy, because an 8 is striving to feel powerful. And so, that's big and very visible and probably quick to act and lots of energy, which a 5 initially might resist a little bit. And that's why it can also be known as that neglected strategy. But ironically, that is one of the key areas of growth to focus on for our 5s, not to become an 8, but to use that strategy of feeling powerful to enhance what they're already good at, where they're already wanting to go. So I'm going to pause just a minute there, Kathy. Does anything with the stress or even what you've noticed in growth resonate with you and your own experience?
Yes, for stress, for sure. Because I try to learn so many different things, if I'm under stress, it becomes extremely overwhelming and I will almost just freeze and not accomplish anything. So that's something I work very hard to try to avoid feeling that stress by doing something else. I'll go and walk or something to try to break that up because it will just make it to where I accomplish nothing. So I have to be very careful about that. So I definitely have picked up on that with the 7 tendency. With 8 on that side, I would say when I feel like I am truly an expert in an area of information, I can project that in a very strong way. So I can definitely tell. I can look back over my career at different points and see that I probably was leaning more towards the 8 in my work environment. Not necessarily at home, but in my work environment, if I'm feeling like I really understand something, I've been doing something for a long time, then it's far easier for me to be very decisive. I can make lead people into influencing them to make certain decisions and things like that based off of what my knowledge is. Almost to a point that I could go a little bit the other direction of wanting to overwhelm people with how much knowledge I have, in a particular area when I'm really excited about what I'm learning about.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm curious. I know before, as we were kind of talking to prepare for this a little bit, which maybe we'll share the funny story here in just a second about that. But you had mentioned you had listened to a couple podcast episodes about other people's 5 experience. And I know that you have been learning, been on your own Enneagram self-discovery process for a while now. Has there been just either like a big aha or just a story or key point that has made you feel like, oh my gosh, other people do this? It feels so good to know, or just anything that's been very validating?
Yeah, I think when I was listening to some of your past podcast of, I'm trying to remember the one that was because I think this is the one I am, is a 5 wing 6.
Okay.
So just hearing how she was sort of categorizing things, like looking at things more in a more technical way, that is something that, like, I love technology. That's not something, whereas traditionally people I've worked with in the past, like, that makes them a little nervous. They're, it's a little bit slower for them. For me, I love that kind of stuff. So when I was listening to her story, it really made a lot of sense to me that that's how I operate. When if somebody tells me they want to do something new, that doesn't scare me when it comes to technology. Like, I'll figure it out eventually. Like, I know,
Yes.
I feel confident about those things. So to listen to some of those stories, it was definitely something I was like, oh yeah, that's me.
And
Where I want to
fives.
launch things, or help somebody else. A lot of times it's help other people do these things. So I struggle a little bit with my own things because I've got so many ideas of what I want to try to do that it's far easier for me to focus in if it's something that I'm trying to help somebody else do. So if they're telling me very
Mm.
clearly that these are areas they're struggling in, I'm like, I can immediately jump in, think of solutions potentially for them. But for my own self, I almost tend to overanalyze because there's so many different paths I could take.
Yes. Okay. So I have a question. I want to go back to kind of the overview of our fives. Whatever you're comfortable sharing, because I know
Okay.
this is always like talking about the most personal thing, your
Right.
personality. But I'm curious if that striving to feel detached and the motive to feel capable, competent, self-sufficient resonates with you. And if so, how have you seen that kind of show up at work or just in life in general?
Feeling detached, I would definitely say if I'm struggling with something in my personal life, if there's some sort of difficulty or tragedy or something like that, I am very, like, I'm good in a crisis because I will completely detach from
Mhm.
the emotions at hand. So I've had issues where things have happened that were very, troubling, that a lot of people will just have anxiety and it sort of lock them down. I don't do that right in the moment. Like, I'm more into the problem solving mode immediately,
Yeah.
almost to a point that it's like I sweep up. If it's somebody else that's experiencing the issue, like, I almost feel a little, like, we can take care of this. Come on, let's go. We don't have time for the emotions. Let's roll.
Yeah.
And then it's only afterwards, like when I'm kind of out of the crisis, out of the situation, and I feel like I've sort of helped to resolve whatever the problem is, that's when I'll feel those emotions. And I generally like to do that all on my own. I don't like to be attached, to the emotion at the time of something that's a crisis. I don't like having the anxiety and things like that. I will do everything I can to avoid that at the time, to not let it be something that bogs me down right then and
Yeah.
there. I'll do that later, when it's
Yeah.
on my off time or
Yeah.
some
In
other day.
private.
Yeah. 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 So definitely I can relate to the striving to feel detached, and I can throw myself into a lot of other things. I do compartmentalize my emotions. So I've been trying to, since you and I have been working together, I've tried to focus, bring what may be emotional for me, I'll bring that up a little bit more often with people that I trust. If I feel comfortable in those situations, then I will try to use, when everyone else is talking about an emotional story, I throw it out. I sort of lob it over the fence and say, okay, well, I have something emotional too, because I don't really do that often,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like I'll throw it in at the last second to, say, I can do that. Wait, I can feel emotions.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I could definitely relate to
I'm
that
so glad you
aspect.
said that because that makes me think of I actually just had a podcast interview today and somebody asked me like what are some of the biggest takeaways people learn from the Enneagram. And I always think that one of them is getting a better picture of what growth looks like for the different types, because just what you said, you sharing an emotion or, whatever it is, and a story that's a little bit vulnerable about how you felt, is huge.
Right.
Versus somebody who, maybe like our fours are a little bit more in touch with that and just
Mhm.
very, open about that. And so it's like there's a lot of good advice out there about what to do and how to live your life and how to work. And for some people though, it's not great advice because they're already doing it and they're doing too much of it. Or it's like to be open and share your emotions. Well, that may not be the best for, another type, but it's great advice for you.
Mhm.
And so just understanding kind of what advice to filter in. And then on the outside, as somebody who knows you or knows your fellow fives in this particular example, when they do share a story or when they do open up, let them know like, oh my gosh, I feel you, or tell me more about that. Don't get defensive or shut them down, because this is a huge thing for them. And just knowing that. And we all have those things, but for the fives, just what you said, Kathy, that's one of the bigger ones. As far as growth goes for our type fives.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
I'm curious too. I want to get in here to our work pet peeves. Our fives tend to like a lot of alone time. Group work isn't maybe their first preference,
Mhm.
especially when they're not in charge of getting to pick their own group. Another thing that I have heard is that they will be asked to look into something. And so they will spill their time and energy into researching, pulling the data, exactly what we've talked about, only to present it to their boss or the group and then say, oh, we actually changed directions. We don't need that anymore, which is so frustrating for
Yeah.
anybody. But for a five, it's soul crushing.
Yes.
And then when goals are not clearly outlined, when the expectation isn't clearly outlined, which I don't know if this falls into this or not, Kathy, but I think you'll be okay with me sharing this.
Yeah.
Kathy and I were laughing before we got started because I've been a little behind this week. And so Kathy was asking me, could I see the slides this morning? And I was like, oh, haven't done them yet. And she was like, I would just like to be able to prepare and think a little bit. And, I know that. And I told her that. I said, I know what I'm doing to you. But for those of us who may not be aware that we have a five in front of us or that we're working with a five, just winging it. No, yeah, you'll be fine. That's terrifying and not, and kind of not setting them up for success. So again, just kind of knowing those kinds of things. I
Yeah.
didn't do it on purpose. And I already
No,
apologized.
no, I know. I knew you knew me well enough to know that I would be like, okay. So of course I did all my side research.
Yes. Yeah. You would jump into
Yeah.
like, yes. Okay.
Researching it. I'll look it up. I'll look it
Yes,
up.
I'll look it up. And then the other one that I wanted to bring back up is we had talked about, but boundaries tend to be a really great thing that fives can do, like setting very clear boundaries. Maybe sometimes too much. But when somebody brings drama or gossip or just emotionally flooding them, it can be incredibly irritating, especially in the workplace, but
Mhm.
really anytime. Is there anyone on here that you're like, oh yes, or is there anything you would add?
Um, I would agree really with this entire list. Like as far as like getting surprised at the last minute on a project, that is definitely a pet peeve. That's happened to me a couple of times throughout when I was in my corporate career, where because I take it so seriously, I want to be able to, well, give all the information. And I remember a time where I had done a lot of research, I prepared, I go to present something that really was talking about processes and efficiencies and things that we could do better that could save the company money. And here was some issues that we needed. I had solutions to the problems I was identifying. And when I got to this meeting, I ended up, the manager came out and said, hey, we're not really as into, we're going to cut your time down to like, it was something where I had prepared for like 10 or 15 minutes. It wasn't like I was going to be doing an hour-long presentation, but he totally changed everything and really didn't see any value of what I was presenting at all. And what was the craziest thing about it was I had actually put off my youngest nephews. My sister had invited me to go to the birth of my youngest nephew. Like it was going to be, she knew her last child. And I put that off because I was like, well, there's this important business thing. You know, I need to help them understand what might help, you know, and when it got dismissed, it was soul crushing. It's the one, you know, sort of experience. It happens, you know, it happens in a corporate environment, but that one really stuck with me because I felt like I sacrificed a lot to try to do something for the good of the company, and to have it sort of dismissed at the last minute was like, oh, you know, it was difficult for me to deal with. But again, you know, those things happen, you know, things change all the time. But for me, it was definitely a harder experience. So I could relate to that, you know, as far as like when processes aren't efficient. So one of the things I noticed was that like, I'm okay with following rules and procedures if the processes are efficient.
Yeah.
If they're not, then it feels very much like I don't like to waste my time. Then I want to fix the process. And I resent a little bit of when somebody insists I do it just for the sake of doing it because it's the process. That type of thing would frustrate me in a work environment. Like, but there's a better way of doing it.
Yeah.
Like we could make this more efficient. You know? So there's definitely those things certainly resonate with me.
Marissa just mentioned, she said, funny, I'm an Enneagram 1, yet hearing about 5 makes me think I might have a mix. Do the Enneagram characteristics change based on whether someone is an introvert or an extrovert? That's a great question. And one of the things that I always recommend looking into more are the instinctual biases, otherwise known as the subtypes. Sometimes where you kind of overlay this preserving, teaming, or pioneering energy with your Enneagram type. And sometimes that is the difference. If you tend to be more, if you have this like pioneering or one-on-one energy is what you'll hear it called, they tend to be more kind of okay in the spotlight. So they will get their needs met of their type strategy, but doing it in this specific way, where there's others who, regardless of what your kind of motive is, what your core desire is, you'll take maybe a backseat. So sometimes that instinctual biases will play a role into kind of how your type is presented. I'm curious, Kathy, it's okay because we didn't talk about it. I know though, just you've done your own Enneagram research too, but is there any additional layers of the 5, whether it's, I know you talked about your wing 6 probably influences more than the 4. Have you looked or have you landed on a subtype or anything in that resonate with you?
You know, I haven't, but I could see where the one, like, is that more of the perfectionist?
Yes.
I could see where the one that can happen because I do like to see things, you know, like I really believe in the right and wrong, you know, and so it's kind of more black and white at times. And so I would have a tendency to be a perfectionist. And I did years ago when I started to see it almost became a little bit crippling because then I realized everyone around me wasn't a perfectionist. So it would drive me a little crazy because, you know, people weren't doing it the way it seemed like was the right way. And so I could resonate with some of the things with the one, but I don't know that I haven't gotten to that stage quite yet of totally fully embracing or understanding what the subtypes are. That's probably our next.
Yeah, we'll talk about that next. That's always so interesting. But you're right. I think it's on the next slide. There is a podcast episode and a YouTube video about here we go, the 1 versus the 5, because that is a common am I this or that, or you know, what are the differences? Same with 3 and 5. I think I mentioned there's some very similar qualities. So that might be a good place to dive in more if you happen to be, I know Marissa is identified as a 1, but if you are also struggling with like, I have 1, I have 5, what's the difference here? That might be a good place to check in with. Before we start to wrap it up, I'm curious, there are a lot of stereotypes and commonalities with our type 5s, for good reason, but it's not always, not every 5, not all the time. And so there can be some misconceptions around that 5 energy, for those of us who are living and working and in relationships with 5s. One of, I think, the biggest misconceptions is that they don't have emotions. So I love that you touched on that, Kathy, about I have them. It's just, I'm not going to deal with them in that moment right there. I'm kind of going to put them to the side. The other one sometimes that comes up is that they don't need other people and they just always want to be alone. That's probably not also true 100% of the time.
No.
And then another one that can come up is that they are insensitive or just kind of aloof or not dialed in. And I think that comes from the fact that they're in their heads. They're not verbalizing it necessarily. Yeah. They're thinking about it. So does any one of those really hit home with you, or would you add anything?
Yeah, I would definitely say, as far as not needing other people, I don't need other people when I'm trying to figure out problems. Like, I sometimes will approach other people for, to kind of bounce ideas off of. I do like that aspect. As far as like having people in my life, a lot of times what it is I'm just more selective as to the people I do have in my life. So I have a smaller group of people that I deeply trust. So once I've opened that door, then it's something, I'm one of those people that, my family will often say, it's like, I'm extremely loyal and very protective of the people that are close to me. So it's important to me that they're, I do pay attention, and that they're, everything I can do to try to help them, like I'll go to that extreme, but I'm not necessarily that way with just anybody. I am much more selective as to the people I have involved in my life. And I like to have deeper relationships. So if it's somebody that's in my life that's a very surface level relationship, that I've kind of discovered after a few times that it's just going to be kind of surface level, I will tend to sort of move on. And I don't necessarily just collect a group of friends for the sake of having more and more people in my life. I like to just have a small group that I fully feel comfortable with and trust.
Yeah. Yeah. And even those kind of things, I heard from somebody over on Instagram when I was sharing that we were gonna have this conversation. There are 6, maybe wing 5, and they were saying, I feel the same way about surface level relationships and small talk. And she said, I think that asking, like, talking about, your morning, like just small talk in the morning at an office is like such a waste of time. It irritates me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so,
I could definitely relate to that for sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes that's required, and you might need to play some office politics, or the person in front of you needs that, and you're delivering, that's one of your clients, so of course. But then also, again, on the outside of that 5, knowing that we probably have a story that the rest of us are telling ourselves about what that means, like, oh, it's just grumpy, or insensitive, doesn't care, so that's why this can help too, regardless of if we know that you're a 5 or not. Just knowing those things, you're probably not going to say, how are you? How's it going? Tell me about your day. How was your new year?
Yeah.
In your email, you're just going to, send me this, buy this.
Yes, that is exactly. I've actually had that come up as an issue from time, where I've had, employees that work for me that were very, wanted to say that kind of stuff, like, how are you? What, and for me, I'm just direct. And so that would a lot of times be perceived in an email context as being, well, she doesn't care. Or she doesn't, she doesn't have time for this. And sometimes that's true, but I recognize that there are people that need that. So I had to start to adapt a little bit with some people to, okay, I know they want a little bit of interaction in the email before we get started. So they're more engaged to want to try to, do what I'm asking for them to do. Whereas other people, you realize you could just be more direct. So
Yeah.
I could relate to that. And even the office politics, I could play the office politics, but it was very draining to me.
Yeah.
So I would find myself doing it for just a period of time. And then it would be so draining to where I'd have to escape and kind of be on my own. And generally my personal time, the end of the day, it would be like, I wouldn't take calls. I wouldn't really talk. So I could go to the grocery store after work and not say a word to anybody, just because I was like, that's just too much.
Yes.
There's too much that's happened today. And it was exhausting. Like I had to sort of be able to have time alone to be able to regroup.
Yes. Yeah. And that is one of those foundational things of the 5 is just that kind of managing and very aware, because I think that can be draining for a lot of people, but it's the awareness that sometimes we're lacking. And so we'll just kind of push through until we're burnt out. But 5s tend to be a little bit more in touch with like, how am I doing? It's draining. Need something else here. Need some alone time.
I would rather start earlier in the day and stop earlier in the afternoon so that I could go walk or go, shut it down. I'll work late if I need to, but it starts to drain me to a point that I recognize I'm not going to be as productive. So don't waste my time. I need to stop here. I'll start first thing in the morning, and I'll be able to be fresh with it. Otherwise it's, I'm just going to spin my wheels. It will not be as good as if I just started again the next day.
Yeah. It's like that law of diminishing returns.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, for those of you who want to dive in more to learning about the type 5 for yourself or for others, on the Enneagram MBA YouTube channel, there's some resources. The podcast, we have a couple of type 5 guests sharing their real life experiences, which are always really helpful and interesting to learn about. Enneagram MBA podcast. And then if you know that you're a 5, there is a guidebook that you can grab that just deep dives into all things type 5. If you want to get yourself a mug, we have those over there. Before we wrap it up, though, Kathy, any final words? I know I'm putting you on the spot, so no pressure, but is there any final words that you would want to share? Maybe anything that I haven't asked you about type 5, the Enneagram, personal awareness, to kind of make this interview feel complete?
Well, I think really the big thing is, I think you and I have been working together for a little bit, and I think it's been very helpful for me to now that I have a better understanding of the type 5, I give myself a little bit more grace in knowing that, okay, it sometimes will frustrate me that I'm trying to learn so many different things. Like, why don't I just let it go? Or why do I need to learn all of this? And I realized after learning more about the Enneagram and the type 5, just realizing that's just my personality. That's just part of who I am. I can let it go without it being a point of frustration. That need to be an expert, recognizing that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it would drive me a little crazy because it's like, no one, people don't seem to care about this item, so I think it's been very helpful during the time that you and I've worked together to kind of help me start to appreciate where I could throw in a little bit more emotion, where I can kind of change the way I look at things and sort of relax in some of the areas where I would be mostly in my head over analyzing something.
Yeah, so well said. It's, appreciating your strengths, accepting those types of things, and then also having an understanding of, where growth opportunities are for you specifically. So well said. Well, Kathy, I appreciate you being here and sharing. Where can people learn more about you if they're